Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's daily chess test, you will attempt to solve two very painful positions. They are both from a training game of mine, which was very painful, very hard to play, very hard to figure out, and I was basically worst from the start because of a mistake I'd made in the opening. But anyway, let's get to it. So the rules you can see on the board, as always. Solve the positions over a real board, set the position up and solve it. Time yourself, 15 minutes per position. Don't move the pieces, write your analysis down. Okay, let's start with the first position. Pause the video, see you in a minute. Okay, so whenever you have a critical position in front of you, the first thing you want to figure out are the key points in the position. Now, the advantage you have when you actually play the game and reach the critical position, you will have some idea of what's going on. When you try to solve it, it's a bit harder, so you're going to have to spend some time. Now, the first thing we can see here is that white is threatening to play the move e5 and win a piece. So that's the most important thing. The second most important thing is the double pressure on the g6 pawn with the queen and the rook, which once e5 is played becomes a very relevant factor, especially considering that this knight, which is defending the g6 pawn, is actually pinned to the queen. Therefore, moving this knight away would, well, undefend the pawn, and if the f6 knight moves, then taking on g6 would actually force the knight to move undefending the queen, and bishop could take the queen. So for example, if you play, I don't know, a stupid move like knight d7, then black just takes, queen takes, plays e5, takes on g6, and you lose. So those are the two most important tactical factors in white's position. Now let's have a look at some more important things. Now, this knight on a4 is misplaced. Obviously, it has a great square on c5, and obviously white would like to get this bishop and trade this bishop off, because that would mean black is lacking even more defense in his camp. Obviously, black's position is better. But if you understood the position well, then you saw a pattern that may help you equalize this position. Okay. So what's the solution? Now, I had a long think in this position, or I had a long think a few moves before, and I figured out a way to get myself out of this mess. The correct way to play this, and I'd spent a long time analyzing this game, so this is confirmed in my own analysis, and then later on with the engine. Also, I analyzed it with Milan, so he thinks this is correct as well, is to play the move b5. Now, there's a very specific idea behind b5. Obviously, the most visually appealing move is knight c5. What knight c5 does, it unblocks your queen to the d5 square, and that's the thing that was hard to see and which you hopefully saw. Even if you used the engine and cheated and solved the position with the engine, I hope that you managed to figure out what the point of b5 was. Now, the most obvious move was played in the game. Knight c5, bishop c5, bc5, and now the point. The point is that after d4 in this position, and bishop e4, and knight e4, and queen e4, you get to play the move queen d5. And this basically defends everything. There's a tempo on the queen, so bishop takes knight is not possible. If queen takes queen, then knight takes queen, and this could even be better for black. I wouldn't go that far, but it's definitely not worse for black, because the pawns are blockaded, the target on c3 is fixed, the knight is, I'm going to say, better than the bishop, although that's arguable. I would prefer to play with this knight, and most importantly, black has a clear plan going forward. a5, b4, create a passed pawn, win. Okay, so that's the normal continuation. Of course, in the game, my opponent didn't take. He played f3, and we played on. Now let's look at some more options. After b5, I had to calculate all other options. I think that the most logical continuation, if white sees why you played b5 is to simply retreat the knight to b2. Now, knight b2 is not a good move. I think black is better here. You don't have control over d5, but you can still continue d4, bishop e4, and you can now continue a5 and just start creating counterplay. Or if you take knight takes e4, queen takes e4, well, now you're slightly worse, but it's holdable. But a5, ba5, rook a5 is definitely better. Okay, it's not an easy position, but I think after knight b2, black should be able to get enough counterplay to equalize, although it's still much harder. Still, from a practical perspective, if I'm white and I see all of this, I'm still playing knight b2 instead of knight c5, because this idea with queen d5 is very strong. There are two more moves I had to calculate, and well, one of them is extremely strong. Okay, and this was what worried me most. Now, first let's have a look at e5. This is not a problem because ba4, e d6, queen d6 allows you to just control everything, and this is obviously a good position. You can play knight f5 because your queen is not pinned anymore, and well, you will be able to consolidate. You're worse, but not much worse. The engine thinks black is better here. I don't think black is better from a practical perspective, but definitely not worse. And what I thought was the second critical move was e takes d5. Because now, and this is a tactical sequence you had to see if you found b5, after you take on a4, he takes on e6 with check. If you don't take this, then, well, bishop takes rook, so let's take. Queen e2 check, the king drops back, queen c4 check, the king drops back, and now simply bishop a8, queen a8. And this may be equal, may not be equal, I'm not really sure, it's complete chaos on the board. I still had to factor all of this in, and I concluded that this is playable. The engine thinks it's 0-0-0, but the reason for that is something no human could understand that will happen 20 moves later. For now, I think black holds, and somehow I'm going to play queen c8, try to wriggle my way out, maybe put one knight on d5 and try to survive. But yeah, this idea with b5, and when we follow the most logical continuation, knight c5, bishop c5, bc5, takes, queen d5, is definitely an easier position than what you saw at the start. Okay, let's move on to the second position. This is from the same game. A few moves later. Pause the video. This is going to be masochistic, and I was so happy after queen d5 that I managed to, well, survive. And then all of a sudden we reach this position, and I'm thinking, what do I do? Do I resign? What? I'm a pawn up, and it's so hard to find a move. Pause the video. I would suggest half an hour for this one. This is really hard. It took me a lot of time to analyze it afterwards, and it took me a lot of time to understand everything, even when I checked with the engine. So the engine is of no use here. Try to figure out what's going on. Pause the video. Good luck with this one. See you in a minute. Okay, so the first thing you do when you reach a critical position, understand all the factors. That's important. The most important factor is, well, white is going to check you and win a pawn. That's fairly obvious. Also, white is threatening to check you and win a rook. And if you don't do anything, if you play, I don't know, a5, then king g3, and you just resign. So there are definitely concrete threats immediately. One move that has to be discarded straight away is rook e4, king f3. Your only move is king h3, king h4, and now king g3 once again. You reach the same lost position. Okay, so that doesn't work. The second thing you had to factor in with maybe losing your rook, with maybe the king going over here and winning the pawn if you move your rook, is that white has two passed pawns. And those are some dangerous passed pawns. Now, the first reason why they are dangerous is they're 3 squares away from queening, and they are connected. The second reason why these pawns are dangerous is because they limit the mobility of your king. Obviously, when this pawn reaches d5, then the pawns are controlling e6, d6, c6, and b6. And your king has no squares. That's just not enough squares. Okay, the third thing you had to factor in is that as soon as d5 happens, the white king wants to do this. And win, promote the pawns. So, white has A, an immediate threat, B, two connected passed pawns, C, a clear route for his king into your position, and if the king reaches its ideal square on b6, you can resign. Okay, so factoring all of that in, there are several candidate moves. Okay, and let's start. All of them are seemingly okay. Okay, the first move is rook a to h8. We are going to look at that. Then we have king e7, we have g5, we have rook h6, and we have rook f4 check. Those are basically the candidates. They all do something immediate to prevent white from doing what he wants to do. Now let's start with rook ah8. This move loses. White plays king to e3 check. You have to go king e7. Rook takes g6, threatening to take on g7 as well. So your only move, and why you played this, is rook h3. This basically cuts off the white king and makes sure that he has no time for d5, king d4. However, after rook f3, rook takes f3, king takes f3, king f7, and rook g3, this is lost. This is simply lost. Because if you try to move up, then e5, the king goes back to f7, king f4, and white is just too strong. His initiative is too strong. For example, g6, rook g4, just preventing any checks. And this is just going to be a very easy task. Okay, so rook ah8 doesn't work. g5 is a very interesting option, which I hadn't even considered during the game. And it may lead to a draw. That's all I'm going to say. All of these moves may lead to a draw with perfect play from black and slight inaccuracies from white. So if you play g5, the most obvious is rook takes g5, but then you get in rook f4 check, and after king e2, trade rooks, rook h8, and now you have a ton of activity. King f2, king f6 attacking the rook, and maybe you can then continue with a5, and maybe you can then continue with something like rook h2. Again, may lead to a draw. At least the rook activity is equal, even though white has much better pawns. I'm not too convinced that this would end in a draw. The engine gives it as slightly less than +1 for white, which doesn't mean anything really in practical play. Okay, let's move on. Another very interesting move is king e7, and it's likely that this actually could end in a draw. If rook takes g6 is played, then rook f8, king g2, rook f1, king f7. We get a pretty similar position to what we saw a minute ago. Again, this could end in a draw, although this position is way more favorable for black, because once this rook moves, I don't know, for example, to f2, you get to take the e4 pawn. And now white has no passed pawns, no two passed pawns, because if d5, you take it. So after king e7, rook takes g6 should actually be a draw. However, if white plays king e3, then it's a lot harder. So you have to play rook h6, defending your pawn. You can play rook g4, preparing rook f3, just covering all the checks. Let's say rook ah8, rook f3, and now the best I could find is e5 and d5, and the idea behind e5 is just to prevent the king from coming in, and maybe you hold this, and I'm just saying maybe. So I didn't see all of this during the game, of course. This position is way too hard to calculate during the game for someone of my level, but this seems like you could hold. It seems like you could hold. Now, Before I show you what I played in the game, and I lost the game, I'm going to show you the correct way to play. Okay, which is the first candidate move that comes to mind, at least it did to me, and that's rook h6. Rook h6 defends your pawn, so king e3, check, king e7, everything's defended. Now, the reason why I discarded this is d5, which seems extremely scary, and there's no way to prevent king d4. However, d5 is a draw, which is very interesting. So d5, you take it, takes, and now you play rook c8. And after rook c8, there's no easy way for him to continue this position. If d6 check, then king d7, rook f7 check, king c6, clear draw. If after rook c8 they play rook e1, which seems better than rook takes c5. No, rook takes c5 loses to king d4. Sorry, that loses. Not rook takes c5. But after rook e1 you try to, I don't know, do something. Move your king to d7. So the engine gives this as equal. It's still much harder for black to play, but okay, so here I'll just show you the engine move. So it's 0.1, 0.2, and the engine just prevents white from coming in. So basically after you play rook h4, and for example rook takes here, you can take on c5, and once there's only one pawn, you could get an equal position. Now the critical move after rook h6, king e3, king e7 is not to play d5. It's not to play d5. It's to play rook f3. And with rook f3 you cover everything. So there are no checks, there is no infiltration, no possible infiltration. And this should be a draw. Although again, extremely scary for black. Rook ah8, best move. Rook g5, preventing any lateral checks. Rook g5, preventing any lateral checks and supporting the pawns. And now your only source of counterplay has to be used, so a5, d5, white's only source of counterplay or play. And now ed5 is the only move. It can be taken straight away, but rook e5 is more precise, forcing the king to commit. If you go here, I check you. If you go here, that's illegal. If you go here, I again check you. So king d8, and now he takes d5, and of course the king has been cut off for one more rank. The engine gives this as 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. If I saw this in my head during the game, I would think I'm just lost. So here's the continuation. Rook h1, seeking counterplay, c6. Rook e1 check, king d4. Rook h4 check, king c5. And now he has sacrificed the rook, so it's a draw if you see all of this, but that's just insane. Rook takes e5, rook f8 check, king e8, c7. King takes c7 is, well, the best move. Rook takes e8, king to d7, rook to g8, and you are holding b4, rook g7, king e8 for example, cb4, c3, and after rook takes g6, black is in time to catch this one, and you are in time to trade off enough pawns to draw. So this is the solution. If you saw all of this, you should go play in Grandmaster tournaments. So let's go over that again. So rook h6, king e3, king e7. Now d5 is a draw as I shown. Rook f3 is the best move. And now rook ah8, seeking activity. Rook g5, a5, critical move, d5, takes, forcing the king back, takes, and this can be held with this amazing sequence of moves. Okay, now to what I did during the game, which is not correct. I played rook f4 check, which seemed extremely tempting. Now, to me, it seemed extremely tempting for a completely wrong reason, and I just lost the game straight away. So obviously king e3 is the move. And now the correct way to go for this rook f4, which may give you drawing chances, is rook f1, king e7. And now your rook is not on h8 yet, but maybe some hope. d5, ed5, ed5, rook h8, rook f4, for example, preventing rook h4, allowing king d4, rook h3 check, king d4. And now this will simply end in a position where white eventually plays king e4 and you have no more checks. If king e5, then rook e3, of course a draw. But when king e4 is played, if you take the pawn, you lose straight away to c6. This is just a lost position. So you don't take the pawn, instead you play rook d1, but again, this should just be losing. d6, king e6, rook f8, rook e1. And yeah, you're just losing this position, rook c7 check. So yeah, but in the game, so it could be lost, rook f4 could be lost even if you take on f1, but what I did in the game is just much worse. I went for rook f6, and now the win is very simple, d5, e5, ed5, and my opponent played brutal chess here. I played rook f8, which seemed like the best move. King d4, king e7, rook e1 check, king d7, and rook e4, the final killing blow. Here I resigned. Whatever I do, his next move is rook g e1, and the pawn's just queen. I mean, I think this is such an instructive position for anybody to solve, even grandmasters, and it's so hard to understand it that, well, hopefully you got something from it, even if you didn't see rook h6 and all of that stuff. I hope it was a good exercise. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you got both positions. If you did, well, congratulations. Go and get your GM norms. Thank you for watching again, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.